Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Sarah Mancall. I am SPICY's Policy Director, and I am delighted to welcome you to the second webinar in our series on Decolonial Perspectives on Psychology. I am thrilled to welcome you today to a webinar series that has been organized by the Reed Sura Decolonial Editorial Collective. Our webinar series, before we get started, I just want to remind you, as with our past webinar, it is going to be posted to SPICY's YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/SPICY. So you'll be able to find it there within 48 hours after it's recorded today. You can find all of the information on this webinar series at spicy.org/decolonial perspectives. And I'm also going to type the URL in our chat today where you can find all of the papers in the special issues of our journal, of the Journal of Social Issues, where all of the papers being discussed today can be found. They're open access through the end of the calendar year. And I'm going to get started by kicking off the discussion to our convener and discussant for the day, Kopano Ratele. He is a professor of psychology at Stellenbosch University. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. It's 1803 in Cape Town. This is where I am. So good evening and good morning, good day, wherever you are in the world. We are really pleased that you made some time to be with us. I see 63 of us are in the webinar today. And so I'm going to introduce this 5 minutes or so, 5-6 minutes, just to ground us and anchor us in for today's webinar. I'm going to share my screen and take it from there. So as you heard from Sarah, this is the webinar organized by a collective of decolonialists. You can see their names on the screen. Gita Reddy, Glenn Adams, Shanaz Safla, in collaboration and hosted by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, SPICY. And we have called this webinar series Decolonial Perspectives on the Psychological Study of Social Issues. I'm just stuck a little bit, so let me just see how I'm going to do this. A little bit of problem right there. Let's see whether this will work. I'm stopping this and then I'm going to try it again. Here we are. Let's see whether it works this time. Okay. So this is the second in a series of 5, totaling 15 presentations. And they're based on the 2 special issues, the collective edited in the Journal of Social Issues, devoted to decolonial perspectives. And we have those 2 prepositions there because we were doing decolonial work in psychology, but also decolonial perspectives on psychology. The first special issue, we themed decoloniality as a social issue for psychological study. You will have seen it, and Sarah said this previously. And just to reiterate, this is for the duration of the webinars. You can access this, the papers, and please share them and just call attention to the work. The second special issue was themed psychology as a site for decolonial analysis. As I indicated, today's webinar is the second to consider the psychology of colonial violence, what is wonderful, at least as far as I can see, is you will hear in one of the presentations by Annabelle, but also the one by Suzanne, and then as I'll introduce Eduardo as well. But the presentation by Annabelle is on love, so a coloniality of love, and I guess it intersects and overlaps with colonial violence. A key idea that we have pursued here, and I guess the presenters might touch on this, is that colonial violence is not confined to the distant past, that is formal end of colonialism, but instead is we are in coloniality. It persists as the air we breathe, as Nelson Maldonado Torres says elsewhere. And by coloniality, we mean racialized ways of thinking and being that have their onset in and roots in colonial violence, and this inhere in the Eurocentric modern order and are inseparable from modern individualist development. Once again, in the paper by Annabelle, you will hear, I hope, some more around individualism and hopefully get to engage around that. An important implication is that colonial violence extends beyond physical space. This is important for us because the discipline in which we're in extends to psychological space, such that complete liberation requires decolonization, psychological decolonization, subjective decolonization. And I should mention the next in the series. So we have had the colonial violence in the first one and the second one, which is today's one. The next one on October the 27th, and the link will come up in the next week. This will focus on coloniality of knowledge in hegemonic psychology. The first one is on rigor, as we call it, rigor or rigor mortis. Glenn Adams, I think, and Glenn, you might correct me later, but I think Glenn will be the convener and discussant. And the papers in that webinar will be by Mona Abuzena, who will talk about decolonizing rigor. And then Joshua Uyeng will talk about decolonial big data psychology, and Fuad Bou Zinedine will talk about inequity and coloniality in international social psychological publications. So today I am sitting in this chair as the chair of today's webinar, and as I said, we're going to talk about the psychology of colonial violence. This is the second iteration on this theme. Today, we're focusing on the coloniality of modern progress. And here, I'm going to introduce very briefly the people who are going to be talking as presenters, and they might say something about the people who accompany them. But the three papers that I have up, the first one will be by Eduardo Rivera-Pichardo. Pichardo will be accompanying in the paper, is accompanied by John Jost and Veronica Bennett Martinez, and they'll talk about internalization of inferiority and coloniality, colonial system justification, and they're focusing on the case of Puerto Rico. As you might know, this system justification is the work that some in the group have been doing. And then Susanne Normann will talk about coloniality of greening or green, and the title of the paper is called "Time is a Worst Enemy: Lived Experiences of and Intercultural Relations in the Making of Green Aluminum." And then Annabella Osei-Tutu, who worked on the paper with part of the Retsura collective, Glenn Adams, Darlingtina, Siaka, Vivian Zogoto, and Ajeweya Akosua Afram will talk about the modernity, coloniality of love, individualist lifeways, and charismatic Christianity in Ghana and Ghanaian world. So the first speaker, Eduardo, was born and raised in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, is a social and political psychology doctoral candidate at New York University, and his bachelor's degree in psychology at Universidad de Puerto Rico, Recinto de Rio Piedras in 2015, and his master's degree in political philosophy at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona in 2017. His research focuses on coloniality's psychological and political consequences, including its effects on well-being, acculturation processes, collective memories, and ideological formation. His dissertation work uncovers the psychological motivations of Puerto Ricans and US Americans' attitudes towards the US regime in Puerto Rico. It examines the colonial ideologies underlying calls for the complete annexation of Puerto Rico, that is US statehood, in comparison with national liberation, that is Puerto Rico independence. Susanne Normann, Dr. Susanne Normann, defended her thesis, Wake Up Humanity, There Is No More Time, Lived Experiences and Meaning Making of Green Colonialism in 3 indigenous contexts, a decolonial approach, at the University of Oslo in March this year, and now has a position as senior researcher at the Nordland Research Institute. What is wonderful about, I'll say this, is we have people from all over the world doing this work on decolonial psychology. The last presentation by Annabella Osei-Tutu, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Psychology, University of Ghana, and a senior Volkswagen postdoctoral fellow, as I said, is on modernity, coloniality of love. Annabella's research focuses on the intersections of psychology and culture, particularly focusing on mental health and well-being in Ghana. We will start with Eduardo. If you're ready, Eduardo, please go ahead, and then we'll go to Susanne Normann, and then Annabella will conclude before we move on to discussions.
Sounds good. I'm going to set up my presentation. Can you see my slides well?
Yes, we can, Eduardo.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to the Resura Collective for putting this series together, as well as the 2 special issues on decolonial approaches to psychological studies. I feel honored to be invited to participate in this series and on this session alongside Suzanne and Annabella. And the title of my talk today is Colonial Mentality and System Justification, a decolonial perspective on support for Puerto Rican statehood, where we explore the psychological motivations of Puerto Rican attitudes towards the US regime in Puerto Rico and its linkage to psychological colonial violence. As an illustrative example of colonial psychological violence central to this talk, here are these images which ran in the Minneapolis Journal in 1898, right before and after the US invasion of Puerto Rico. It evidenced that even before the military occupation, the colonial psychological project in place was already willfully created and spread by colonizers back then. In this presentation, I will argue that these forms of colonial violence persist today and may be behind so-called post-colonial arrangements in the layout of US statehood for Puerto Rico. So decolonial articulations, as Kopano was talking about it just a minute ago, proposes that colonial violence is not confined to events of the past. Instead, it persists as hegemonic ways of thinking and being inherent in Eurocentric modes of society. In doing so, it centers its analysis on the concept of coloniality, which, as explained by Puerto Rican philosopher Nelson Maldonado Torres, coloniality has to be distinguished from colonialism. Colonialism denotes the historical, political, and economic system in place and the historical event that colonialism marked for most years and since the 15th century. Coloniality instead refers to the long-standing patterns of power that go well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration, but that still to this day define culture, labor, and intersubjective relations, and even knowledge production, as some other talks are going to talk more about. So a contemporary psychological manifestation of coloniality that is central to my approach to this question is colonial mentality, which include attitudes that are self and group defeating and that reflect the internalization of inferiority among the subordinate. For instance, colonial mentality reflects internalization of oppression characterized by a perception of ethnic or cultural inferiority and an uncritical preference for colonizers' ways of being. And past research on colonial mentality has focused on the negative effects on mental health among Filipinos, people of Ghana, Puerto Ricans in the United States, and Pacific Islanders also in Alaska. However, less research on the relationship between colonial mentality and political psychology has been conducted. Overall, contemporary colonialist phenomena and their ideological expression have attracted less interest. This could be given the psychological scholarship, for the most part, has treated colonialism as a phenomenon of the past. However, we stress the fact that present-day ideological manifestations of colonial mentalities could perpetuate coloniality and the colonial violence it still produces to this day. Therefore, the proposed objective of my research program is to advance this line of inquiry by investigating the present ideological manifestations of coloniality and its political consequences. In doing so, I provide a socio-psychological analysis of an ongoing colonial enterprise, that of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, a U.S. colony since 1898 up to the military invasion. For over 40 years, the United Nations and other international bodies have recognized the colonial status of Puerto Rico and have urged for a process of decolonization for the island. To this day, Puerto Ricans still denied the right to vote, full access to Social Security, Medicare, and other federal system programs. And under U.S. hegemony, Puerto Rico today faces a staggering number of challenges: the lowest per capita income in the United States, the highest poverty rate of any U.S. jurisdiction, an $123 billion debt crisis, very slow recovery from Hurricane Irma and Maria, and recently just suffered from Hurricane Fiona, and a long history of mass exodus, which has seen almost 20% of the population decrease since the 2004 economic recession. These recent problems have reignited a debate over the merits and demerits of the U.S. hegemonic rule. Despite these disadvantages, the discussion over the political status of the island remains controversial, even in Puerto Rico. The attitudes of Puerto Ricans regarding the political future are dispersed across three options: Puerto Rico statehood becoming the 51st state of the United States, maintaining the territorial status quo, that is the colonial status quo today, or achieving political independence from the United States. Perhaps surprisingly to some, there's still strong support among Puerto Ricans for and legitimation of the U.S. hegemonic rule, with supporters of U.S. statehood and territorial status quo dominating the political discussion. The pro-independence movement reflects a sentiment of minority today. So in terms of legal and political consideration, it is true that two of the three options, statehood and independence, should be considered as alternatives to the status quo. Supporters for statehood point out that if Puerto Rico were admitted to the US, it would be allotted to senators and 4 representatives in Congress, as in the case of Iowa and Connecticut. However, on the other hand, supporters of national independence prefer that Puerto Ricans address their social, economic, and political woes directly and autonomously. They believe that the best option is to grant the island 3.2 million inhabitants the right to determine their own destiny and shape their own laws. However, a decolonial social psychological analysis, as the one we're going to provide here in this talk, will suggest that pro-statehood and pro-independence sentiments differ greatly in terms of ideological motives and objectives. From a more theoretical perspective, Puerto Ricans' acceptance of the hegemonic role played by the US in Puerto Rico, either via support for territorial status quo or US statehood, exemplifies processes of colonial system justification rooted in colonial mentalities. Our contribution to the special issue provides, to advance this inquiry, provides a decolonial and system justification perspective to this current Puerto Rico political status debate. We critically examine the colonial ideologies underlying calls for the annexation of Puerto Rico in contrast to national liberation, that is Puerto Rico independence. Our central objective is clear, is to ask the following social psychological question: is support for US statehood generally motivated by anti-colonial, pro-egalitarian, system challenging motives, or instead reflects colonial system justification rooted in colonial mentalities? In other words, does US statehood represent a decolonial alternative to the colonial status quo already in place in the island? In doing so, our work draws heavily on the work of Martinique decolonial thinker Frantz Fanon. Acknowledging the complex consequences of colonialism, Fanon was one of the first to conceptualize colonialism not only as a means of appropriating land and territory, but also appropriating history, culture, and processes of identity construction. Central to us are the ideological consequences that these forms of psychological colonial violence has in producing internalization, inferiority, and colonial mentality. Consistent with system justification theory, the internalization inferiority on the part of the low status group members contributes to ideological support for the system. So the main idea here is that colonial socialization processes and violence fosters a sense of inferiority among the colonized, and that this sense of inferiority jeopardizes prospect of self-assertion while increasing feelings of dependence and legitimation of colonial powers. Also, on top of that, according to system justification, individuals concerned with psychological motives to reduce uncertainty, and here we operationalize epistemic motives, should lead to an endorsement of system justifying beliefs. So to investigate these ideas, we recruited 344 Puerto Rican adults in public squares and shopping centers in San Juan, Puerto Rico, during two different time periods in 2017 and 2019. Participants were approached by Puerto Rican research assistants, and if they consented to participate, they were asked to complete a short online survey. In assessing internalization inferiority, participants were asked to indicate their levels of agreement or disagreement with a set of 7 stereotypes, 5 negative and 2 positive, for each of both groups, those two groups being the in-group, Puerto Rican, and the other group, the out-group, US American. We then computed an index of internalization inferiority, where positive scores indicated a sense of inferiority among Puerto Ricans, and a negative score, a lack of this sense of inferiority. To assess colonial system justification, we administered 3 different system justification measures to assess the perception of the colonial system as fair, legitimate, and justified. We asked participants about the economic infrastructure of the system, that is a capitalist system. We asked them about the US federal system that overrules the territory, and we also asked them about the local Puerto Rican colonial system. And turning to a summary of our results, as depicted in this path model, which summarizes all of our main results. Indeed, internalization inferiority led to a rationalization of status quo and support for the colonial system. And that in turn led to a preference for maintaining the colonial status quo in place. And not only that, it also led for a preference for US statehood, that is the full annexation of Puerto Rico as a US state. Now, the lack of an internalized inferiority and the ideological rejection of the colonial system mobilized some Puerto Ricans to support national independence. And also consistent with system justification theory, individuals concerned with psychological motives to reduce uncertainty endorse system justifying beliefs. So this result suggests that pro-statehood option is best understood in colonial terms, at least on a social psychological level, rather than a decolonial system challenging preference, as it linked to internalization of inferiority and colonial system justification. And indeed, we see Puerto Ricans who express a lack of internalized inferiority and also an ideological rejection of the colonial system and in mobilizing their political preference towards national independence. In ongoing work, we further investigate our hypothesis with exploring these questions with a larger representative sample of Puerto Ricans. Here we also address the question of coloniality through a formal operationalization of colonial mentality. So through a local collaboration with major national TV outlet, we were able to recruit 2,000 Puerto Rican adults across all major regions of Puerto Rico. Important to note, surveys were administered weeks before the last status plebiscite. And after completing our items on colonial mentality and general system justification, they answered the official plebiscite question, which actually asked Puerto Ricans if Puerto Rico should be a state of the United States and it should be admitted immediately. To assess colonial mentality, we adapted 3 items from the original colonial mentality scale developed by David Okazaki in the Filipino-American context. And here are the 3 items of our surveys, which denote 2 themes. 2 items denote the theme of colonial debt, that indebtedness to colonial power, and also the last item refers more to a sense of internalized inferiority in relation to the colonial power. So results based on our 2,000 respondents suggest that adherence to colonial mentality was indeed associated with a yes vote for statehood in the 2020 status plebiscite. Corroborating our findings as well from study 1, results also suggest that the perception of the existing local and federal systems as legitimate were associated with a yes vote for statehood in the 2020 status plebiscite. So taken together, these results demonstrate that colonial mentality leads some Puerto Ricans to justify and even bolster their relationship towards the US hegemonic system through support of US statehood. Our results suggest also that adherence to colonial mentality was associated with the most recent plebiscite vote in 2020 and a vote for statehood. Conversely, the rejection of a colonial mentality and the perception of existing social, economic, and political system as illegitimate was associated with support for national independence. So once again, this tells us that pro-statehood option is best understood as a colonial one, as it's heavily rooted in colonial mentality and system justification. On the other hand, the lack of group-based inferiority, lack of colonial mentality, and the ideological rejection of the colonial system seems to mobilize Puerto Ricans to think beyond the limits of colonialism, and then which is a response that appears to identify Puerto Rico national independence as a potential tool for decolonization. And although national independence or support for national independence remains a minority today, there are signs that resistance to colonial arrangements are gathering strength. For instance, in 2019, a peaceful uprising led to the removal of the pro-statehood and neoliberal governor Ricardo Rosselló and his cabinet. And in the last elections of 2020, the pro-independence party won 14% of the vote, which was its highest total since 1952. This comes in contrast to this recent surge of US partisan push for Puerto Rico's statehood in the United States, where Democrats in the US tend to be strong supporters of Puerto Rico's statehood. The opposite is true in Puerto Rico, where liberals and progressive strongly oppose the annexation of Puerto Rico and favor greater political sovereignty. From this perspective, the annexation of Puerto Rico as a US state does not seem to represent a system challenging escape from US hegemonic rule over the island. In fact, it represents the opposite, the entrenchment of the US colonial project and colonial forms of thinking among Puerto Ricans. Like the annexed territory of Hawaii, Puerto Rico's statehood may represent a transitional step into a settler post-colonial project that reinforces colonial intergroup inequalities. However, and as a concluding remark, Fanon also warned us that the achievement of national independence does not necessarily mark the end of coloniality. It might simply involve a reconfiguration of the colonial structure of power, elements of which may be preserved in subsequent societal organizations. A national independence project lacking a decolonial objective beyond territorial disputes may very well lead to a reconfiguration of old colonial ways of thinking inherent in the organizational and power structure of the new nation state. Thus, national liberation may be a means to decolonization, but it does not necessarily represent an end of colonial ways of thinking or being. Therefore, complete liberation requires forms of psychological decolonization. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think it was perfect timing. You took all of the time you were allocated and you did it splendidly. So thank you very much. We will hold on to the questions till the end. My compatriots are gathering the questions as we speak, and then we will put them to you and to the other speakers at the end. All of them. Okay, that's all right. Yes. Okay, Suzanne, you want to go ahead?
Okay. Good night. Good evening. Here in Oslo, we have the time 6:30 as well, and yeah. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the possibility of presenting and also for sharing this the work. I will share my presentation. And if you can hear, I'm not sure if you can hear a baby crying and if it interferes a lot with the sound. So please tell me if it's too loud. Yeah. This is the name of the article, Time is Our Worst Enemy, Lived Experiences and Intercultural Relations in the Making of Green Aluminium. I want to start my presentation by a short anecdote from this weekend. Here in Oslo, we celebrated the social forum, and in a panel on the struggle for the land areas, a Sami participant that followed an Indonesian and a Brazilian participant who had previously been telling about all the extreme violence they are exposed to as a result of their struggle to defend the land. He said, well, we Sami, we are not shot at that often, but still there are problems in the ability of creating our future as a consequence of the big projects that are implemented in our lands. And what he said is something that I often hear from Sami people, as if they need to somehow explain their case or defend that they are in fact complaining a situation that is interfering with the protection of their rights, even though they are not subject to so severe violence their brothers and sisters indigenous in other countries. So I think the article that I will present some elements of was an intent to think a little bit more about how the indigenous Sami communities in Norway's experiences with what they have called green colonialism, and the experiences of Amazon communities in Brazil with what they often call neo-extractivism may have commonalities. Their experiences may have commonalities. Yeah. The article takes the case of green aluminium and tries to think and follows tries to engage with the experiences of the indigenous Sami in Norway and the Amazon communities in Brazil. In her book from 2014, Mimi Scheller wrote, in her book Aluminium Dreams, The Making of Light Modernity, she wrote, tracing the silvery thread of aluminium across time and space draws together some of the remotest places on Earth, alongside some of the centers of global power, some of the richest people in the world alongside some of the poorest, and some of the most pressing environmental and political concerns that we face. In my research, these remote areas are exemplified by the experience of the Sami and the Amazon communities. I want to say what I mean by green aluminium. In climate change mitigation, aluminium has gotten an important position. It is a light, flexible, and potentially recyclable metal. So it is adequate to use aluminium in as a substitute for steel in such as cars, airplanes, and other, and also in large infrastructures. Because it's so light, it reduces the quantity of gasoline that is necessary to use in the car, right? However, aluminium has a large environmental impact itself. It has large emissions. So in this process, in order to gain market shares, producers of aluminium are seeking to greenwash, as some would say, their production. One of the things they need to do that is to base their aluminium on renewable energy. They need hydropower or aeolic or wind energy or another renewable energy source in order to be able to position their product as green. And in Norway, where the worker unions and political parties on left-wing parties have sought to find ways of an green transition that does not interfere with work possibilities, green aluminium has also become a choice for the worker class. So it is not only implemented from the companies themselves, it's also lifted as a positive process from the worker class in Norway. Yeah. In Norway, we have several aluminium producers. One of those is Norsk Hydro, a Norwegian company. The other is Alcoa, a North American company with 2 plants in Norway. These companies are now entering into contracts with the newly implemented wind power projects in Norway. Norway has been a country that historically based renewable energy production on hydropower, but during the recent years, we have seen a large rise of aeolic energy. And now it is no longer public funds implementing. It is, we are talking about huge transnational investment funds seeking for licenses and constructing this large parks. You can see an example of one of these parks in one of the photos. What is important to say is that several of the largest wind energy projects are based in the mountains that the Sami reindeer herders need to do their herding. The Sami people is an indigenous people living in areas belonging to Norway, Sweden, Russia, and Finland. About 10% of the Sami people in Norway still have been able to defend their work as reindeer herders. Reindeer herding occupies large areas of land because these animals live in semi-wildness during large part of the year, and the Sami protects them from several dangers and accompany their migration when they need to migrate in different stations of the year in order to survive the harsh conditions in the mountain and search for food, search for water, and escape predators and also now the consequences of progress, right? We can talk about railway, highways, tourism, hydropower, military movements, and wind energy. So in many parts, the Sami have engaged in protests against wind energy. They say in some areas that this is the final infrastructural project that will may end their possibility to do herding in the mountains, because the reindeer is a very shy animal, and the large turbines, the noise from them and the aspect of them scares the animals away, taking away their very much needed grazing lands. And in the last photo, you can see an example of a small protest camp.
Suzanne.
Yeah.
The photos are not showing. Sorry, this presentation is not showing. Did you want to show a presentation?
Are you not seeing my presentation?
No, sorry.
Oh, that's crazy. Okay. I was sure that you saw it. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
This was the first image. Then we had, I will start it. This was the aspect of the book I was telling. And these are the photos. So I just leave it a little bit there for people to see. Yeah. On the other side, these companies, Norsk Hydro and Alcoa, they bring their raw material from the Brazilian Amazon. The aluminium industry in the Amazon was implemented from the year 1979. This was during the military dictatorship in Brazil. Of course, the communities in the Amazon had they did not have their rights respected. They had no consultations when the bauxite adventure saw its onset. We talk about the eastern Amazon here, the state of Pará in Brazil, and small parts of the state. Maranhão is also blended into the bauxite extraction and alumina production. Alumina is the white powder that is produced from bauxite, and which is often exported to other countries in order to produce aluminium. So here we see several companies engaging. There are several bauxite mines, and in the Amazon you have many different communities, indigenous communities, Quilombola communities, Ribeirinho communities or river dwellers, and also farmers that are all of them confronting and struggling against neo-extractivism in order to protect their territories. And as you all know, probably know, with the last 4 years in Brazil, with the presidency of Bolsonaro, the desire to implement even more mining projects in the Amazon has increased, and now we have the possibility of seeing another 4 years if Bolsonaro is able to win the second round. So we see a connection then through a value and supply chain between the experiences of the communities in the Nordic context, the Sami reindeer herders and the Amazon communities. In my research, I committed to ethnographic research in courtrooms in Norway. I did individual and group interviews. I did document analysis, participant observation, and I did this in the context that I told you about. I identified 3 main narratives: narratives of loss, narratives of dehumanization and violence, and dealing with bad faith as common themes in what the people in these two very different socioculturally speaking contexts experienced. Now I just want to go into one of them, the bad faith. And I'm sorry that I have been speaking a little bit slow, so I will try to do this quicker in order to finalize some time. So now, what is bad faith? I build my conceptualization on Lewis Gordon, who expanded decolonial theory, proposing that a colonial status quo can become maintained through more subtle than brutal practices. The concept bad faith can be a loop to observe how subjects and institutions might lie to themselves to evade acknowledging certain truths, responsibilities, or ways of acting. He noted how epistemologically bad faith can manifest through only admitting perfect evidence to change one's opinion. So if we go back to the research sites, when the communities see their rights unrespected, even though consultations and audiences and even law trials are in place, and both Norway and Brazil have signed the ILO Convention 169, do we talk about the lack of knowledge, or do we talk about, can we see expressions of bad faith? The communities that I talked to had deep felt frustrations of how processes that are in place formally do not ensure their rights are respected in practice. In Norway, we very frequently see we need more knowledge discourse. Even now that the Supreme Court sentenced the Norwegian state for violating the indigenous human rights of the Southern Sami people through the largest wind energy projects on European soil, the OED, the Oil and Energy Department, has still not taken action, arguing that they still need more knowledge even after the Supreme Court trial. And in the communities of Brazil that see themselves and their bodies highly contaminated by the industries that loses their hair, that see their skin infected, that observes that community members are getting sick, they're not able, of course, to prove the causation of these health damages because they don't have the budgets or the scientific competence to provide the proof that the state will recognize. So in my research, I found it interesting to see these experiences as aspects of bad faith. And to finalize, I have been trying to think about green coal aluminum as a colonial intercultural relations. From Norway, we have seen very few manifestations of solidarity from worker unions and progressive political parties to the Sami reindeer herders or to the communities in the Amazon. It seems that sentiments of crisis and urgency in the climate crisis may deepen colonial wounds instead of repairing them. And while aluminium, according to Scheller, builds an accelerated modernity on speed, arguably unsustainable and exclusionary for the majorities, the urgency of climate change mitigation seem to interact along with other factors and in sustaining bad faith practices. Yeah, this is what I wanted to share with you, and I'm sorry about the thing with the presentation in the beginning.
Thank you, Suzanne. It happens. I don't think it's we followed your presentation very well without the slides, but the slides help to see the context you were speaking about. So thank you very much. Once again, we will wait until the end to have questions and interactions with your presentation. We will move on to Annabella. Hello, Annabella.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you, Eduardo, for your presentations. So these two presentations have highlighted the harmful effects of coloniality and rapid modernity. But another focus of the JSI special issues and also of this webinar is to look at the inherent coloniality in psychology, mainstream psychology. And so in this presentation, we use the experience of research in Ghana to illustrate how mainstream psychology can also be a source or inherently colonial. First, we want to look at studies and constructions of love in mainstream psychology. First, love is often defined as a sense of closeness, belonging, attachment to significant others, so more in affective terms. And such constructions often emphasize equal status relationality, mutual personal growth, self-expression and expansion. And it is often characterized as free disclosure and eager pursuit of pleasurable companionship. Now, one may wonder, how is this colonial? To the extent that these constructions are often presented as just natural, tend to often question other constructions of love that are not consistent with mainstream psychology research on love. If we turn the lens to the other end, perhaps looking at African-centered decolonial approach, we see a different construction of love that we have termed maintenance-oriented love or materiality of love. Copious research from mainly West African settings show that love is often constructed in material ways, involving tangible evidence such as distribution of material resources. And this is embedded in African realities that focus on relational harmony, respect for authority, and mutual obligation. So using the African-centered decolonial approach shows us that the constructions of love in mainstream psychology are not purely natural. They reflect a certain reality, and definitely not that of the African reality. So we embarked on this study to look at how Ghanaians construct love. Now, I must say that Ghanaian contexts are not monolithic. There are several competing actors, and sometimes their experiences, practices, and ideologies are almost or even contested or different in some shape or form. So in the study of love, for example, we focus our work on looking at how different actors, cultural actors in Ghana might shape the construction of love. And specifically, we focus on one of the primary actors called Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. Now, previous work has identified PCCs as a technology for social change in most African settings, including Ghana. And a major aspect or characteristics of PCC is that they have a tendency to promote personal accomplishment, aspirations, and achievements. I share a picture on the right here showing this is a seminar that happens, is organized by one of the PCCs in Ghana. And it is often aimed at helping people develop life goals, self aspirations. And so this is just to illustrate the context in which people who attend or engage PCCs interact with. And we set off with the hypothesis that engagement with PCCs will be associated with acculturation towards individualism, lifeways. That is, typically associated with modernity. And we also make the point that the engagement or any engagement with PCCs would also orient people towards seeing love in terms that are described in mainstream psychology, mainly psychologizing love or seeing love in feeling terms rather than the material ways that I previously discussed. So to test our hypothesis, we embarked on two that are also presented in the JSI paper. Without going into much details about the procedures, I'll just highlight a few things that we did. In the first study, which was an interview study, we purposively selected or recruited 61 Ghanaians who were affiliated with either mainstream Christianity or PCCs. And we asked them to define love. So the question we posed to them was, to you, what is love? We further asked them about how they express love to spouse, to children, to elders. Now, the data was analyzed using a theory that we have just described, whether participants' responses will reflect the maintenance-oriented love that is more found in most West African settings, or that their responses will reflect psychologized love that is seen in mainstream psychology literature. So here are the findings. Broadly, we realized that our participants describe love in material terms, in terms of expressions of love. So let me quickly read through some of the responses that we got from our participants. The first participant says, and this person is from, so TWMC should stand for mainstream church or traditionally Western Mission church. So the person says, I have been raised by my father since I started my schooling. When I come to tell him any contribution in the school, if he's not the first person to give, then he will be the second person to pay for me. So this person is talking about receiving financial support for school. The second participant indicates, my director showed me love by giving me free accommodation, and even the employment that I have is a love that he's showing to me. Permit me to read the last one. It says, when I was going to give birth to my first child, I was in the hospital. My aunties came with my parents. The greatest of all is my mom, because she's the one who has been going, coming, doing cooking, washing, and everything. So you can see that our participants generally describe love from the tangible support as a tangible support that they received. This pattern was mostly visible or evident in mainstream church respondents. However, if we look at one of the themes that was quite few, that is focusing on or describing love as verbal expression or emotional support. First of all, there were a few people who talked about this theme, and most of them happened to be PCC respondents. So for example, the first participant says, as a child, my father spent a lot of time with me. We just talk as someone and their brother. You get it? I sit with my father, we chat, we talk. First, you notice that the person is talking about verbal expression as a form of love, and also the egalitarian nature of their relationship. Also, the last participant says, have experienced love or somebody loving me. Whenever I'm down or I'm stressed up and my wife talks to me calmly in that manner, you see, I feel cared for. So again, this is a verbal or psychologized construction of love. And as I've mentioned previously, these themes about verbal expression and emotional support were few, and they were mainly from PCC respondents. Now, to build on our hypothesis further, we continued with a quantitative study. Again, the details of the procedures and analysis are in the article. Kindly take a look at them as I'll give you just a brief overview. So in this study, we gave our participants a research task. There was a stimulus, and the stimulus, as you can see, is based on African relationship dilemma. This dilemma is often used on radios, and it often leads to a lot of heated arguments. So please don't try it at home, especially if you have your spouse and your mother in the same room. But so here it goes. It says, imagine that a person is in a boat with the person's mother and spouse. When the boat turns over, the person has the opportunity to save only one. If the person chooses to save the spouse, then the mother will die. If the person chooses to save the mother, then the spouse will die. Now, the question we posed to participants in our study were to make a personal choice. Who would they save if they face this dilemma? The second one was a judgment of social norm. We wanted them to estimate the percentage of people in their community who would choose either option. And so from our analysis, we see that on the whole, there's almost like a 50-50 split. But then if you look at the bars on the right, where we have daily attendance, we see the effect of the PCC individualism. How do I mean? For participants who engage with PCC on a daily basis, we realize that fewer chose mother, whereas those in mainstream churches chose mother. So this is a significant difference between the two groups. So then what do we make of the findings from these two studies? We have the option of interpreting the findings based on hegemonic psychology perspective, that the responses to choose spouse, or the response about love being a feeling or an affective term, is quite more modern, is consistent with a developed individual. And in fact, previous studies have shown that people who are associated with Eurocentric global modernity tend to choose spouse. Using this standard, however, to explain our findings will end up pathologizing tendencies that are in African settings. So the challenge then is to now turn the lens again and use a decolonial African-centered perspective. Doing so will achieve two things. First, it will depathologize patterns that we observe in African settings. In fact, the choice to construction of love as material, it is also associated with ideas of obligation and issues of harmony. So it makes sense in this setting of embeddedness where people have obligations towards family and even distant relatives. The other challenge or the other strategy is to denaturalize the patterns we see in mainstream psychology research, that they are not natural, they are not superior to findings from elsewhere, settings outside Eurocentric settings. So using this approach would help us to realize that patterns or concepts and ideas in psychology are not value-free. They are shaped by adaptive forces, and that within the African context, the experiences or the findings we observed are consistent and they are adaptive really to this setting. The question though is, would these findings be applicable to other settings? And who would benefit if we use an African-centered perspective to interrogate psychological knowledge and research? That is a question I will leave for us to discuss as we go into the question section. Before I end though, I want to acknowledge my collaborators who have contributed immensely to developing these ideas that I've talked about. And I also want to acknowledge the funding we received for this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. Once again, to keeping close to time. Appreciate that. We will open up to questions and comments in a short while. And I'm going to make it just a very brief remarks and put the questions to Annabelle, to Suzanne, and to Eduardo. If you will, I appreciate it if you would come onto screen so that we are in the same space, at least visible, all of us. And if my compatriots, my fellow travelers, Glenn, Shanaz, and Gita are around as well. Eduardo, thank you very much for really the contribution. It's a fantastic piece of work that you have done, and for bringing to be instructive for some of us who are not familiar with the politics of Puerto Rico in particular. As you say in the paper, that you brought together psychological analysis and political levels of analysis, and I think for this is a great piece of work. What I still don't quite fully understand, and to put to you is please correct me, but I hope you can take this in response in responding, that the people who choose not the status quo but statehood, your analysis is that they are also the group that have internalized inferiority. So they justify not just the status quo, but also statehood. I'm not quite sure about statehood, and I would want to have you say a little bit more about that. I mean, you say some bits in the paper, but perhaps for the audience here, why would statehood be analyzed in terms of internalization of inferiority? So that's that particularly not always, or rather, let me ask: are there other possibilities that perhaps there's more to this the choice of statehood than just internalization of inferiority? And perhaps this is my own ignorance, really, although I have had follow some of the discussion, particularly from some of the people like Nelson Maldonado Torres about Puerto Rico. So you mentioned a number of things, including the hurricane in 2017, and the state of the economic state, the income in Puerto Rico. So you don't. Would you say a little bit more about that? Again, perhaps the group that choose statehood, and to a lesser extent the status quo, about in choosing statehood, is this one way of not just justifying of inferiority, but in thinking a way out the economic conditions of Puerto Rico. Could you say a little bit more about that? But in general, bringing together psychological and political analysis, I think this is a fantastic piece of work, and I'm not just for our special issues going forward. I think the possibilities for understanding this, particularly as you bring Frantz Fanon, who I have been having a class here in South Africa around just reading Fanon, just as a Suzanne mentions Lewis Gordon, that I'm, what Fanon said, I guess from our perspective, what actually did Fanon said, and just reading him about and trying to read him from today's South Africa. So you please respond to that, but let me just take the others as well. Suzanne's work, two things. Maybe the first one is this. I wasn't quite so against thanks, Suzanne, but would you say a little bit more about this group of workers? So you say, well, here's the Green New Deal, the support for this, what's called inclusive and just transition. So one of the points you make is this just transition is not that just at some times, particularly for indigenous communities like the Sami. So part of the people you interviewed, I assume that nobody from that group was somehow related in any way to the Sami group, but they are workers in a capitalist system, and somehow their interest were on the side of, if you will, capital, or the new the people who are sub-industry basically, and as opposed to the Samis. I guess another way is to say, so among the indigenous communities of the Sami, there were no people who are workers. So that's what I guess I'm asking at all. So the interests are disparate for that. And I might have also one other thing before I ask that question. So what you find is this loss of life worlds, the meaning systems, resulting from this green transition, wind power, aluminium production. Could you say a little bit about this, the meaning part, the meaning system rather than the life worlds? Not sure if I might have lost contact a little bit there if you had said it, so beg your pardon. And then the last part, and maybe this is a little bit out, but the just transition is not necessarily as just as it's inclusive. And I have in my head something that I just also read about ammonia, about green ammonia, for instance, in South Africa, and some of the contestations. So the contestation is not between the people who are doing this green technology, and only between them and the kind of old industries, but also it's different interest groups within the green movement. I mean, this is an important point. So in my head, about how do we think about decisions from decolonial approaches between those kinds of things? So people who are doing, say, green ammonia or green aluminum versus people who want to protect land, for instance. Could you say a little bit more about that? And then I hope that this was clear. Last is this work on love by Annabella and colleagues. So Annabella, the first study on the interviews and then the study on quantitative work. So the position, what you want us to hear is, so here are two opposed in Ghana. I suppose this happens in other African countries. So I kind of psychologized conceptions of love, and you did say material conceptions of love and maintenance conceptions of love, material/maintenance conceptions of love. I suppose there's some assumptions that in the kind of psychologized, let me say it this way, and I know that you have written, at least one of your compatriots has written about this. So when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, and you can see a kind of injected coloniality in me. Like, okay, although I follow the argument, and I think it's great because I support this argument, that when you are telling people about what other literature call it transactional forms of love, right? So support people materially, whether it's food, whether it's money, it feels as if we need to marshal more work from the South, from African-centered conceptions of love. It says, actually, this is a justified ways of thinking about love. That love is not just about talking and caring, because what you are doing in that moment is not just attacking, or attacking is a word. It's not just like taking conceptions of love. You are really attacking a whole system of understanding how people live their lives, right? In particular, and then you're juxtaposing this with the PCC, the Pentecostal charismatic churches, this prosperity Christianity. You're saying, well, here you have people who have adopted kind of psychologized Western conceptions of love. And in that moment, of course, you show the plurality of conceptions of love in Africa. So my question basically is I want to say, how understandable is this when you're talking to an audience that does not come from the perspective, a decolonial African-centered perspective? How convincing would you think it is for them to understand this particularity? But the second part of about that is I think because of colonialism, so this conception of care, of talking love, of self-disclosing love, as they call it, is quite rife, really. I'm sure in Ghana as it is in South Africa. In fact, it is, as far as I can see, in urban areas a lot, but also even in rural areas, because television gets there. It's the hegemonic way it's increasingly hegemonic way of thinking about love. Could you say a little bit about that? About that the hegemony, the hegemony of psychologized conceptions of love in many African settings, and how one might attack them, how might write against them. So that's all I have to say. Can you respond to this, and then we'll have Glenn or Shanaz just put questions from the Q&A to you, and we'd have the second round on that. So Eduardo, and then Suzanne again, and then Annabelle.
I would like to give Annabella the opportunity to the question first, since the question is more fresh, I guess, if it's answered that, and I already wrote down mine. So Annabella, if you want to, if not, I can also answer, no problem, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much for that question. So it is an important consideration. First of all, the psychologized love tends to be viewed as superior. And so if someone talks about expressing love in material terms, it might suggest that the person is not modern, but there's that inherent danger in that, because the psychologized love tends to work towards personal growth. It's about fulfilling self-expansion goals to the detriment of obligations that we have towards a tall line of relations. And so how do I convince somebody who is not in this same space to perhaps view the impact or the materiality of love? I refer the person to Cole's work in 2011. She interviewed Ghanaian migrants in Europe and America, if I remember correctly. And one of the reasons why these parents had left their children in Africa was to go and get money or work in money and return to their families so that they can take care of the families. If we take a mainstream psychology perspective, we might say that the parents don't care. Why are they not there to hug their children, to, be with them constantly? But their pursuit abroad is read differently in our context. If you have a parent abroad who can send you money to fulfill your school fees, material needs, that children view as love. And so it's an important discussion that we'll have to keep going. But this is where my mind went to when I was listening to your question. Thanks,
Annabella. Suzanne, Eduardo?
Yeah. Well, yeah, if I go first. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the questions. I am not sure I got the first one correctly, but I think you wanted me to tell more about the situation of the what I perhaps call lack of solidarity from the worker groups in Norway, right? Towards the Sami herders and also towards the communities in the Amazon. Well, I did not interview them, in fact. But what I want to say is that there are huge efforts in Norway to defend work when Norway needs to go through a defossilization of the economy, right? Norway is a country very much dependent on the production of oil. And there is a huge fear in the worker class of losing work. And it's a fundamental fear, right? So then supporting green industrialization initiatives becomes so important, right? So it's the urgency and it's the crisis and it's also well, the fear of losing work that makes this push so important, that the ability or the priority of looking towards the consequences of this green industrialization and using the voice that worker unions and progressive political parties may have in order to support the very few indigenous families engaging in reindeer herding, they do not use this opportunity. And we always talk about the need of work, but then I think you suggested, the work of these indigenous families is not recognized as work, right? And we're not only talking about the Sami herders, this is also about the Amazon communities. And when we discuss wind power in Norway, the reality of these Amazon communities, where the bauxite that is needed for the aluminium production, it's completely silenced, right? It's not even part of the conversation. And I did interview workers in Brazil from worker unions having collaborations with their Norwegian comrades. And they also made this critique of the very unjust ways in which workers in the north and in the south are included or not included in this development of green technologies and green industrialization. And when I spoke about meaning systems, I think this is a way to try to connect how we produce. Well, in one part is a way to see how we produce knowledge is not happening in a vacuum, right? It does not happen. It happens in a very material world where perhaps our meaning systems, the way we give meaning to our surroundings, to the rivers, to the landscapes, to the sea, to the elements, and also it's also part of what makes us produce knowledges, right? So when we talk about epistemicides, as we often do in decolonial psychology, this is not only killing knowledges; it's killing meaning systems through the destruction of the landscapes of people and the inability of people to reproduce their meaning systems and give the meaning to the life that they have, that they want, right? The connection to that many indigenous communities have to the ancestors and connecting the ancestors to the possible futures that they want to construct. And to the last question about how to see these different positions in trying to prevent further climate change. Well, as a start, to try to answer that, I think it's difficult to see this as one position and the other only. I think and then because the consequence might be okay, but then we have to support the needs of the majority, right, of the numerous people, and then you have very few communities, indigenous communities left in Norway, and then should they be sacrificed once more in order to produce welfare for the rest? That is one part, and the other part is that these people have knowledges that could be important for all of us in order to prevent further climate change. These knowledges are connected to the landscapes that they protect, and when they lose these landscapes, we all may lose important knowledge and meaning systems that could also put in a very critical light this speedy and accelerated modernity that we are building, and that has shown very detrimental to the future of this planet.
Yes, absolutely. I was not saying at all that we should sacrifice the Samis or the Amazon. Absolutely no. No.
Yeah, I was referring to not your question, but the discourses that we are become so used to listen to, right?
Yes. No. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Please.
Yes. Thank you, Annabella and Suzanne, for those answers. So yeah, to your question about, I guess there's two questions. There's a political question, and then there's like a psychological question, and that's, I guess, the contribution of my paper. So the political question is, yes, statehood will mean, in a political legal consideration, an end to the colonial rule. Now, psychologically, would it perpetuate coloniality, or would it actually challenge coloniality? My argument and the evidence through the economic levels is justification, political levels is justification, linking it to colonial mentality with internalization, inferiority, self-hatred, tells me that psychologically the answer is no. Statehood is not a decolonial option. It could be an anti-colonial option, as independence also could be an anti-colonial option as well. That could also perpetuate coloniality if it's not reconfigured in a way that would actually transcend the ideas and our imaginations of a post-colonial, actual post-coloniality world. So in terms of economic and political considerations, I'll leave the political scientists and the economists tell you what is best for Puerto Rico. As a psychologist, I will tell you what is bad for Puerto Rico in a psychological, social level, cultural level analysis. And I'll keep it like that.
Okay.
That answers your question.
We could take this up quite well, particularly Fanonian, the move that he makes in this later work about. But thanks a lot. Len, do you have questions from the Q&A, or Shanaz?
Hello, everyone. So there were questions for you, Eduardo. I think you have been talking to the question of colonial mentality in the status quo versus statehood choice. I think some of that clearly related to what Kopano was engaging you on. And then, of course, what you said, which is that the second question has a more psychological slant to it, and really this is a question that I think is relevant for all three speakers. The question of what ongoing or planned initiatives are in place to realize this objective, the stated objective of psychological decolonization. So really anyone could respond to this question, even though it was initially directed specifically to Eduardo. And in Kopano, if I may, I think there was one other question for Eduardo. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Eduardo, from Alan, who asks, can you speak about colorism in Puerto Rico and indeed Latin America, and is this connected to coloniality and the church? Thank you. Back to you, Kopano.
Thanks, Shanaz. The first one, anybody wants to tackle that? Suzanne, Annabella, Eduardo, and then the second one, Eduardo. Anyone wants to tackle the first question about psychological decolonization and plans in place?
I think we have, there are so many places on earth and so many initiations to decolonize psychology, so it's difficult to say something outside one's own practice, right? And immediate circles. What I can say in Norway, at least, the Psychological Association have created a climate committee, and inside that climate committee, there is a subcommittee on green colonialism. So there is an intent to try to think through a psychological loop and a practice inspired by the liberation psychology of Latin America, produced from El Salvador in some decades ago. To think how we can engage in these processes, and it's an important exercise, and it's also somehow a difficult exercise because there is the risk of reducing the colonial dynamics and structural issues to individual distress when you do at least empirical work in this context. So the idea is to go very careful about and do this through dialogues with the affected communities and try to come up with a way psychological researchers and practitioners can engage in meaningful ways, because the other way around, it would be as it is now, and it would be a very, very, very small engagement from majority community psychologists in Norway.
Thanks, Suzanne. Annabelle or Eduardo, do you want to respond?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
go ahead.
so within Ghana, I have to be careful what I'm going to say. So there isn't a structured program per se, but I can refer to some of the work that we continue to do. My research group, including Glenn Adams and the others I cited in this work. So beyond looking at using love as an illustration, we've gone ahead to also study other constructs that tend to be taken for granted, that they cannot be sites for colonial violence. For example, we are currently examining and interrogating conceptions of well-being. I'm also aware of a few others who are engaged in similar work in Ghana, but we don't have, a group that has a concerted effort within the country. I could be wrong if anything like that exists. In my own small way, I hope my PhD students are here. For the past 5 years, with the assistance of Glenn Adams and other scholars who share this ideology, we have the PhD Decolonial Seminar. And I think it's an important space for PhD students to start engaging with this idea. And that should also inform the kinds of research they do, the methodologies they adopt, and how they even interpret their findings. So this is the little I can say, but there could be more that I'm not familiar or aware of.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thanks for that, for alerting people to the work, just as Suzanne did, that you do. The hope of this group and the work we're doing is to build these networks from around the world. It's 1931, but can you indulge us in one more minute for Eduardo to respond, and then we'll have Sarah come in and just close. Len has just indicated that we have asked if anybody wants to stay longer for the presenters to engage with you, but if not, we will wrap it up, at least this session. Eduardo, please.
Yeah, I'll be short. And yes, I will say the same thing that Annabella was doing reference to, specifically this group, the Sura Collective. I think in the past 3 years or 4 years now, since that Cape Town meeting, has really advanced a lot of the work, and I'm very grateful for all of you. And in Puerto Rico, recently the Asociación de Psicología, the Psychology Association of Puerto Rico, just published a recent book titled Psicología en Puerto Rico, Desafíos Contextuales y Retos para la Acción. So Psicología, Puerto Rican psychology, challenges, contextual challenges, and ways or path towards action, which I think addresses and put forward a lot of decolonial perspectives, and this recently got published this month. So I will put the name down there, so those who want to think more about psychology in Puerto Rico and applying decolonial perspective to different views. So shout out to my colleagues in Puerto Rico who I'm sure are around still, maybe.
Okay. Thank you, all of you, and once again, the questions and my comrades, Glenn Adams, Shana Safla, and Geeta. And we're about to close, but Sarah, you want to have the last word from Speezy? If you're, yes.
If I can say one
much.
thing, sorry,
Sure.
first, just to say, so if you do want to attend our session for an informal conversation at the end, please copy the link from the chat before we close the window for the webinar, and then join us there. Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers today. This was wonderful. And if you loved today, please plan on joining us for the next 3 webinars. You can find all of that information at spici.org/decolonial perspectives. We're going to post links to all of the recordings and registration for future webinars on that webpage. We'll also send out email blasts to all of SPICI's membership database, and we'll post links to future registrations on our social media. We are going to open registration to our next webinar next week, and the recording for this webinar will be up on our YouTube page in about 48 hours. Thank you again to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So bye everyone, and I'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everybody. Good night.